What do you get when you combine nude vampires, screaming bloodless corpses, a zombie outbreak, Patrick Stewart speaking in a sexy lady's voice, and the end of the world as we know it? Naturally, you get Tobe Hooper's Lifeforce, the batshit, pun intended, crazy sci-fi horror film about body-hopping soul suckers from outer space. While we cover plenty of outlandish movies on this channel, Lifeforce stands as one of the most bizarre and underrated. One of those big budget oddities you can confidently say would not be made in this day and age, combining state-of-the-art visual effects, shameless nudity, deliciously over-the-top performances, and a very dry British sense of humor. Lifeforce is the epitome of a movie that needs to be rediscovered by a whole new generation. That's why we're giving it some love on the best horror movie you never saw. Based on the novel Space Vampires by English author Colin Wilson, Lifeforce is a fascinating curio that, when it's all said and done, feels like it shouldn't work given its many disparate elements. But somehow, it all comes together much more cohesively than it has any right to. One reason is that, for the most part, the movie plays all its zany events with a straight face. It's mostly British cast, lending an air of sophistication and seriousness to the proceedings. Lifeforce wouldn't work half as well if it winked knowingly at the audience. It presents its events with severe directness, with the gradually dire events treated with dread and concern by the main characters. That's not to say it's a stuffy affair. Far from it. When the time is appropriate, Lifeforce leans in fully to its absurd premise, unafraid to dish out some really intense, visceral horror upon the audience. The premise involves the return of Halley's Comet to our solar system after 75 years, and the crew of astronomers who discover it has not come back alone. In the comet's wake is a very large, ominous spaceship that turns out to be home to a series of bat-like creatures and 3 very naked, seemingly human bodies locked in suspended animation. As can be predicted, bringing these bodies back on board their ship isn't the brightest idea, and soon after the ship mysteriously loses contact with mission control for a period of time. Cutting ahead, the spaceship is rediscovered by a rescue mission, with the crew vaporized but the nudists intact. Brought back to London for inspecting, hell soon breaks loose when the female humanoid starts sucking face with a variety of unfortunate fellows before escaping into the wild. It's up to the surviving astronaut from the first mission and a sturdy SAS agent to track her and the other space vampires down before they decimate the population of London and eventually the world. Blimey. Best known for dark horror films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Salem's Lot, and The Funhouse, director Tobe Hooper is working with a much wider, ambitious canvas with Lifeforce, and you'd be forgiven if you didn't recognize it as a Hooper film at all. After all, he was seemingly comfortable in the world of small-town, low-budget horrors, notable for his creative camera work and gritty, you-are-there realism. But in 1982, Hooper had found massive success with his Steven Spielberg-produced frightmare Poltergeist, opening up some opportunities for the native Texan, who had proven he could work with a sizable budget, a dizzying array of visual effects, and of course, a producer who heavily involved himself in the production. Having Hooper move from small-town USA to outer space, then a plague-besieged London, was an inspired choice, and Hooper seems quite in charge of the large-scale mayhem that follows. The screenplay was co-written by Dan O'Bannon, and Lifeforce was released the same year as his directorial debut, The Return of the Living Dead. Not unlike that film, Lifeforce has a delicate line to walk in terms of getting the tone just right. You can't be expected to take this lunacy too seriously, but if you play it strictly for laughs, the audience will disengage, unconvinced there are any stakes for the characters and the world at large. As directed by Hooper, Lifeforce commits to its premise from the start, embracing the dire apocalyptic elements of the story while unafraid to go balls-to-the-wall horrific when depicting the ravaging effects the space vamps have on their victims. And yes, these suckers can inflict some damage. To help prove he's not messing around, Tobe Hooper made sure to populate the crew with top-notch names, such as cinematographer Alan Hume, who had shot Return of the Jedi and For Your Eyes Only, two-time Oscar-nominated production designer John Graysmark, legendary film composer Henry Mancini, and VFX maestro John Dykstra, who helped change the industry with his work on the first Star Wars. It's Dykstra who really shines here, ingeniously crafting a multitude of clever visual effects moments, including the destruction of London, which was accomplished by creating a very impressive miniature version of the city. Yes, by today's standards, some of the effects may be dated, but there's no doubt that they work in the context of the movie and continue to hold up. It certainly helps that Hooper was given a very sizable budget from his producers at Cannon Films. Approximately $25 million was spent on this insane epic, a hefty sum for any movie back in the mid-'80s, and a very large amount of money for Cannon, which was known for its low-budget horror and action films at the time. Cannon had obviously hoped Lifeforce was going to be a Star Wars-sized hit for them, but in what galaxy does a movie with an exploding skeleton woman rake in the big bucks? Still, you have to be grateful for this big swing from the Cannon folk. Perhaps they were thinking big picture and knew this movie would become a cult classic many years down the line. Whether or not that translated into profit for them, well, what's money anyway? All of it's on the screen in this case, you have to admit that. Cannon would go on to collaborate with Hooper on Invaders from Mars and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 the year after Lifeforce, forming an undeniably nutso trilogy for which all of us, well, okay, maybe just some of us, are grateful. When it comes to the cast, Hooper populated his movie with a plethora of classy, reliable British character actors, which you have to love given the material they're playing with. But front and center is American actor Steve Railsback, a theater actor best known for his infamous portrayal of Charles Manson in the 1976 TV miniseries Helter Skelter. Railsback's character Carlson isn't the most engaging protagonist to ever grace the screen, but the actor makes up for any shortcomings by going full-blown unhinged with the role, captivating the audience with some very intense work indeed. The understandably emotional Carlson is complemented nicely with Kane, a deadpan SAS officer who's all business all the time. Kane's played by another highly respected theater actor, Peter Firth, who brings a necessary calming influence to the otherwise chaotic proceedings. That is, until he has to kill a vampire who immediately transforms into a gigantic bat creature. That'll rattle anybody. The ever-alluring Space Girl is played by Mathilda May in one of her very first acting roles. At the time, a 19-year-old dancer from France, May does what must be considered an admirable job here, considering it could not have been easy shooting practically all of your scenes in the buff and sucking face with a handful of middle-aged Brits. Frankly, we have no notes for her performance. None. Then there's Patrick Stewart, as an unlucky doctor who finds himself the vessel of the Space Girl. Yes, Professor X walks around with a sexy vampire woman from outer space inside of him for a little while, but that's not so weird, is it? Stewart goes for broke here too. Like everyone else, he's fully committed to this maniacal enterprise, and he even gets a little smooch for his troubles. This movie absolutely has something for everyone. Special props to Henry Mancini's hard-hitting score are deserved as well. The highly respected and influential composer, best known for classic scores like Breakfast at Tiffany's and The Pink Panther, saw his chance to make a mark on a massive sci-fi flick and went for it. That main theme, which makes you think an NFL game is about to start, is highly memorable. By the time the exceedingly wild finale arrives, you'll absolutely feel as though you've seen it all. And maybe you have, since not every movie has vampire aliens, comets, possessions, zombies, living skeletons, the destruction of London, and this. Hell, there's even a large beam of light going into the sky at the end, which is something you see in half the superhero movies released nowadays. A simple logline for the film just won't do, and that's why it's so memorable. It's worth noting that if you have a choice, there are two versions of Lifeforce available, the director's cut and the theatrical. The director's cut is about 15 minutes longer than the theatrical, and it's the director's cut we've talked about here because, obviously, Why deprive yourself? Scream Factory put out an excellent Blu-ray some years ago that contains every last bit of information on the movie you could possibly want. Lifeforce is the most misunderstood movie of Tobe Hooper's career, but it proved he could step away from the suburbs and backwoods of America onto grander, more bizarre things. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist will always be his greatest achievements. But like its villainous space girl, the bombastic madness of Lifeforce cannot be ignored or resisted. Best to just pucker up and give in.
Just a little more. Just a little more.